Hi, I'm John Barclay, and welcome to the Fatality Free Future podcast.
My name is Holly Ferguson. I'm the co-host of this podcast where we explore the challenges and possibilities of creating a fatality-free future. And this is the very first episode of this podcast.
Yes, looking forward to the season.
Because it's the first episode, I wanted us to delve into a little bit of a backstory as to why we're here. First of all, we've both got this name on our shirts, Barclays. We're from a company called Barclays.
Yep.
We're based in Western Australia, but we actually do work globally. We like to say we've got a global reach, but local touch. And we deliver primarily safety leadership programs, safety services, audits, inspections, all that sort of thing. You are the founder, John, and I want to hear a little bit about your story because it's going to help us understand not only why you started the company, but why you're actually starting this podcast.
Going right back, I'm originally from the chemical industry, operations, and through being in operations, I had some safety roles. So I was a health and safety rep, I was an emergency response team member, and got into a few different roles and supported some behavioural safety programs and those sorts of things. And later on in my career, I was a first responder to a fatality. So one of our colleagues was crushed by a suspended load, and that really hit home to me. I've been doing a lot of work in the safety space, and again, reflecting back now, I was probably a bit like everyone else. Safety is just something we have to do. There's these things the organisation makes us do, and I could see it was sort of important, so I'd sort of made sure I got involved and I got engaged in it. But after being involved in a fatality, it hit home just how serious this stuff was that we were trying to do and how we weren't doing it as effectively as we could. So that sparked my journey, and I've been on that journey ever since to really understand why safety works, why it doesn't work, and it probably embedded a purpose for me, which took me a little while to understand what the purpose was. But, my purpose was driving me to prevent fatalities at work.
And we work mostly with high-risk industries, don't we?
Yeah, look, I think fundamentally a fatality can happen anywhere, but most of them are happening in high-risk industries. So I've sought to understand high-risk industries, so resources industry, construction, manufacturing, logistics, agriculture. There's fatalities happening in all those high-risk industries. So yes, that's where we spend most of our time. That's where we seek to try and understand the context behind fatalities and do everything we can to help these organisations prevent them.
And back then, that fatality that you were a first responder to, it prompted a complete career change, really. As you said, you were already in that safety space, but this took you down that safety leadership pathway, would you say?
I think what I learnt reflecting through all of that experience was how important cultural attributes are to the effectiveness of safety. So we say, culture eats systems for breakfast, right? So you'll probably hear other people say culture eats strategy for breakfast, but I tend to say culture eats systems for breakfast. Because what happens typically in the safety space is, we build these really robust systems, layered systems, and we think that's given us our level of protection because we've got all these layers of things. But what I learned and what I'm passionate about is it doesn't really matter what that is. Everyone does it differently. It doesn't really matter what that system is. If the culture and the people aren't bought in and thinking about this and the way it goes about shaping their work, it's just not going to work.
So you were in this space, you were working mostly as a consultant?
Yeah, so I got really passionate about it. So I actually left and worked for a global organisation. Some people might have heard of it, but BST, Behavioural Science Technology. So that sort of grounded my fundamental learnings around behavioural science in this space. And through that time, I was obviously continuing my studies in safety. So I ended up completing my Masters in Occupational Health and Safety. But I found that as a tick the box, I had to do that so people could see that I understood safety management. Doesn't necessarily excite me as much as safety culture and people. So I went down the path of consulting and I was working heavily in the space of safety leadership development, safety culture, maturity development, and behavioural safety programs, which I know some people have mixed opinions on. But I had a really positive experience with behavioural safety programs. I really enjoyed them. It got me working with the frontline workforce and engaging with them and seeking to understand what was going to work best for them. So it took me down, 15 odd years of doing that work, and I really enjoyed it. I learnt a lot and still learning a lot.
And then in 2018, you decided, hey, I'm going to start my own company.
Yeah, look, I think having good family support around me, I was getting curious about wanting to do things slightly differently, and I'd learnt a little bit outside of what BST were doing at the time and what that was all about, because I do like to learn, so I was learning from other aspects, not just what we were practicing within that consulting firm. I was learning things from other areas, and I felt there was more I could add by not just sticking to one way and actually trying to add multiple dimensions to what we did. So with great support from my family, I started the business in 2018.
That's a big step.
Was a big step, and it was, it's a scary step to take. Fundamentally, we all have one financial security, and starting your own business makes that a little bit insecure for a while and continues to be. It's always one of those challenging things in business, but I definitely don't regret it. It's really given me a chance to learn more and bring more people in around me and learn from other people, but hopefully they learn from me and we can add greater value to our clients.
And it's also given you the opportunity to develop what you're calling a fatality free future. And it is a program we can deliver, but we also want to spread this message. And that's why we're doing this podcast.
There's this challenging messaging out there around zero harm, and I'm not a big believer in this goal of zero harm. I just think that creates lots of complexities. But there's a fundamental value what underpins that, which is, just not hurting people at work. But the reality is work has implications. Work has implications around risk. So people are still going to get hurt, right? And we want to try and minimise that. But I think, what we can achieve is not killing people at work. So I've had this aspiration, I've had this purpose to drive for, to eliminate fatalities at work. And I really feel like we're making really good headway in understanding how to get there. And the podcast is all about sharing those. It's not just all about what Barclays do. There's lots of information out there. And we want to be able to articulate that to people, interpret that for people, or maybe give some practical connections to that. But yes, we are, and we're continually building a program that will help organisations focus on the things that matter most to hopefully achieve a fatality-free future.
Now that we have the background and a bit of context set as to why we're here today, I think we can just dive into some of the foundations.
Yeah, let's go.
So, SIF, serious injuries and fatalities. What does that mean? What does that mean in Australia, actually? What are some of the statistics that we're seeing around those?
Yeah, so, serious injuries and fatalities are all those life-altering outcomes. Obviously, fatal injuries means the loss of life. Serious injuries generally mean we've changed someone's life for permanently changed their life. And unfortunately in Australia, we still have anywhere between 150 and 200 fatalities a year. Been trending down per se over the last couple of decades, but at a really, really slow rate. And even if you look at probably the last few years, it's probably starting to trend back up again. So there are too many people not coming home from work.
Right. And the way the world sort of started talking about SIF was way back in the 1930s with someone called, and I'm going to read this so I can get it right, Herbert William Heinrich.
Yes, yeah. The Heinrich triangle, which was the original version or all of this, was seeking to try and understand what happens day in and day out that has the potential to lead to a fatality or a serious injury and fatality. Now, when you actually try and understand why that was happening, as the Industrial Revolution was growing, people needed to start getting insurance and all those sorts of things started to happen. People were getting hurt at work and companies were having to pay for all that, so they needed insurance for that. So what Heinrich was trying to understand was, well, if I want to insure people, there's different levels of impact or harm people are going to have. So I need to try and understand a ratio there so I can try and help insurance companies come up with a decent way of insuring or organisation. So he spent some time looking at data and saw that for X amount of low...
I actually have this stat. Should I read them?
Yeah, go for it.
So he had a theory that for every major injury, there are 30 minor injuries and 300 non-injury events.
Yeah, so he's talking through about like that one significant event, serious injury, then having those sort of minor injuries, first aids, medical treatments, and then those near misses. So what he then had created was this triangle, high frequency, low consequence things, in his terms, should be predicting the level of low frequency, high consequence outcomes.
And then in the 1960s, 30 years on, a man called Frankie Bird, he validated and updated the model using over 1 million incident reports. So he proposed a ratio of 1 major injury for 10 minor injuries, for 30 property damage instances, for 600 near misses. And then they made this, which we've got in front of us, a combination, which we now know as the Heinrich and Bird triangle.
Yeah, so I mean, what I've got in front of me, the top half of that is the Heinrich and Bird triangle. And I guess, again, all Bird was trying to add to that was that there'd been better data collection over that 30 years and had a lot more data to look at, so was probably able to validate the concept of high frequency, low consequence to low frequency, high consequence, was adding a few extra things in there because people were starting to track damages and behaviours and those sorts. So starting to add a bit more to that. And yeah, again, was really implying that if you're having these sorts of numbers, you could reasonably predict you're going to have this type of outcome soon.
Both of these people and this model itself, that it has a good intent behind it, but over the years it's become a little bit, would you say, misinterpreted?
Yeah, I think it's led to some unhelpful practices. So I guess what I mean by that is the implied nature of, if we can reduce all those near misses and those minor injuries, you're going to prevent these more serious fatalities. Well, we're many years on now and we've looked at the data, and lots of people have gone and done data on this, and that's not adding up. So if you look at the trends, those more minor injury types, so first aids, medicals, restricted work cases, even lost time injuries, which are starting to get pretty serious, but depends how you're categorising them. But those have been on a very good steady decrease over the decades, right, and really getting down to low levels now. But then when you overlay the number of fatalities and life-altering injuries, that's not trending down at the same rate. So the question has to be why, right? And so therefore, yes, it's had a really good intent. It's driven a focus on safety and a focus on trying to prevent harm at work, but I just think it's missed some fundamental implications around what leads to minor injuries versus what leads to more serious injuries. And that's where the SIF research started to really change our paradigms on that.
And we're going to get into that, all of this later in the season, and really unpack, like you say, the data, the research, all of the things that are contributing to this.
Yeah, and I think the fundamental thing I've taken away, because I mean, all my studies, even our master's degree, was all based off Heinrich and Bird. I mean, they're teaching that at the academic level, and then you try and put that into practice. I think the thing I've taken away from it was Heinrich and Bird were trying to say it was predictable, like it was a predictive model. Well, it's not. I think we're now seeing that it's actually not a predictive model. But what I want people to understand, the reason why we still use it as a visual, and the reason why we still use it as a context setting, it's actually descriptively correct.
Right, okay.
So what I mean by descriptively correct, if you actually think about it, there's a whole heap of things going on day in and day out. A little bit of damage here, maybe a near miss or a small trip here or something. There's lots of these high frequency, low consequence events going on all the time. Now, as an organisation, we want to try and contain some of those things and maybe try and focus on some of those things. But not all of those things ever have the potential to be a fatality. So if we're actually about fatality prevention, then a lot of that high frequency, low consequence events can be distracting, right? Can actually distract us from what matters most. And that's what I want to keep exploring through the Fatality Free Future program and the Fatality Free Future podcast is how do we help push out some of the noise without not trying to tinker with them and prevent the rolled ankles and the broken feet and the broken fingers and those sorts of things, because we do want to try and prevent them the best we can. But how do we not get distracted by that and actually still stay focused on what's actually going to potentially kill someone?
I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit here, but you are still someone that goes out and delivers in the field. Do you have an example of where, to you, there's been a glaring thing that this could be something that causes a fatality, where maybe the people on the ground, the leaders, are too preoccupied with what you just said, the noise, little things?
Yeah, look, the first one that comes to mind when you asked me that, I was in a workshop, it was a mining workshop, and they had some people removing a radiator out of a haul truck. And for those who can't contextually think about that, it's sort of 2 metres wide by 2.5 metres high, so it's big. And it's probably a good half a metre in width. So what was happening was they were lifting it out of the truck to go put it into its stand so they can inspect it and fix it. Now, that took a crane or that took a overhead hoist. And all the conversations that was happening was wearing your gloves to make sure you don't get hurt when you're handling things and you're not getting cuts and bruises. Making sure you're wearing your hard hat in case something fell off. The conversations were about using taglines so you don't get under the load. Now, I'll sit there and say that's really good. That's a part of the serious injury and fatality prevention part of that, but the conversation was more focused on not being under the load. But if you can visualize something that's 2.5 meters tall and only sort of 0.5 meter wide, it's not likely to fall straight down. It's most likely to fall and then go left or right. So where they'd set the taglines up, they were actually standing in those zones where if it actually did fall, it would have crushed one of them.
Right.
The conversation wasn't that.
Yeah.
The conversation wasn't about where the safest zone was to protect from the one bit in that whole job that had the potential to have a fatality or a serious injury or a fatality. That it wasn't a deep enough conversation. It was more of a compliance conversation. Just make sure you got a tagline. So that's sort of where I see it playing out. The focus was on, are their sleeves rolled down? Are their gloves on? Have they got their glasses on? Are they clear glasses? Is the hard hat on back to front? It was like, that was what a lot of the conversation was about. And I'm just sitting there going, yeah, I get it. I get it. But I'm like, really? I'm more worried about how you're going to manage that if it falls. How are you going to make sure someone's not going to get crushed by it if it falls? And just changing the conversation for those who are listening and do have these conversations. I just want to say, once we had that conversation, that whole work group changed their whole engagement to our conversation. When we were talking about sleeves rolled down gloves, I was noticing rolling of eyes, looking around, not listening, not paying
It's
attention.
stuff they've all heard before.
And to be honest, they're thinking, who cares? I do on high risk work all day. I'm working on big gear, big lifts, high pressure, high hydraulics, hot equipment, and you're worried about this as a conversation. So I think it really matters what we're talking about. And I think people really care about when we're talking about the things that have the highest risk to them.
Changing the conversation, that's where it starts.
Change the conversation.
So John, to close out, for a leader or organisation who they may be readjusting their focus on serious injuries and fatalities, where would you start? What advice would you give them?
I'm sure as we get through these episodes, there's going to be a lot more specific advice to give. I think my general advice to our listeners and to leaders out there who are trying to engage their workforce and have conversations about things, as that last comment was, change the conversation. Like, are you talking about what matters most? Like, are you really sitting in and having a conversation around what matters most? And are you prepared to have a conversation with people about things that have the potential to kill them? And if we're not prepared to have a conversation around that, then how are you expecting people to pay attention to it the right way?
The stakes are high.
They are. Stakes are high. And unfortunately, too many people lose their life each year.
And that's why it's so important and why we are discussing this on the Fatality Free Future podcast. John, thank you.
Thank you. Look forward to the ongoing episodes.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Fatality Free Future podcast. Head to our Fatality Free Future hub on barclays.com for more information and to access everything we spoke about in this episode.